Afternoon, everybody. My name is Natalie Renew, and I'm the Director of Homegrown. I'm joined today by my teammate Karen, who's behind the scenes, making all the technology work for us. I'm so pleased to have you with us today and for this really important discussion around integrating and incorporating family child care homes in early Head Start Child Care Partnership grants. In just a minute, I will introduce my friend and colleague, Adrian Briggs, who's a high quality family child care provider in Philadelphia, who currently provides Head Start services. But before I do that, I want to share with you how pleased Homegrown is to be partnering with the Ounce, and we're so thankful to Margie Wallen for all of her contributions to this project. We are also really thrilled to be working with the Early Education Achievement Consultants, Carol Kientz and Kathy Colfer, who will be leading our conversation today, and just really thank them for their partnership and their willingness to support this project on a really, really tight timeline. Before I turn it over to Adrian to share a little bit of her kind of experiences as a home-based provider, a family child care provider participating in Head Start, I want to just share a couple of thoughts around why Homegrown is facilitating this conversation and bringing folks together. Homegrown is a collaborative that's focused on improving the quality of and access to home-based childcare, including licensed family childcare. And really, we, as we look around the landscape, we know that there are about 7 million young children who are having their early childhood and childcare experiences in home-based settings. And many of these children really reflect priority populations of Head Start. So these are infants and toddlers, Black and Latinx families, children with special needs, those in rural communities, and those with low income, and those whose parents work non-traditional hours. And really, as we think about how to improve the quality of services that these young children receive, we really recognize the opportunity to further include family child care in Head Start and early Head Start as a critical strategy. We see this opportunity as really supporting improving quality, increasing revenue and business stability for home-based care, and really importantly, ensuring that these young children and their providers and families have access to comprehensive services, which are critical. Right now, we know that there are about 10,000 children in family child care model in Head Start, an early Head Start, and it's really our goal to grow that number. So thank you to our partners for joining us with us in this conversation today, and thank you to all of you for being a part of this discussion. Before I turn it over to Carol and to Kathy to really lead us in our presentation, I wanted to start our discussion with a provider. Adrian is, as I say, a super high quality provider in Philadelphia who has been participating in Head Start for several years. And I wanted her to just open our conversation, sort of sharing her experience as a family childcare provider who has been working in Head Start for several years. Thank you so much, Adrian, for joining us today and for sharing your reflections on being a family childcare provider who's engaged in Head Start and supporting families in Head Start.
Thank you, Natalie. Yes, as Natalie said, I'm Adrian Briggs from Little Bits Family Child Care Home. I have been doing Head Start for about 6 years now. I was already a Star 4 program, Keystone Star 4 program, who also participates in Philly Pre-K. With Head Start, it changed my program in the sense that, one, it changed my curriculum. I went from working with Mother Goose to create a curriculum now. And then also it changed my assessment tool. So I was using Outcome Work sampling, now I'm using Teaching Strategies Goal. So that has brought more professionalism to my program. It has made me focus more on the academics for the children. It has helped me prepare them better for kindergarten readiness, more parent engagement, and it has just upped the level of my program, has taught me how to do more administrative work, and just to give the professional teaching experience that the children deserve. That's me and my program.
Thank you so much, Adrian. I really appreciate you just kind of opening our discussion with those thoughts and just underscoring what we see as really an opportunity to integrate family childcare with Head Start and early Head Start to increase the rigor of curriculum, to improve parent engagement, and to really provide additional financial support to the amazing home-based providers like Adrian, who do incredible work to support children and families. So thank you so much, Adrian, for sharing your reflections. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy and Carol, who are going to lead us through our discussion today.
Well, thank you, Natalie. And hi, everyone. My name is Kathy Colfer. I'm a recently retired Director of Childcare, Head Start, and Early Head Start Childcare Partnership Services, which supported family childcare providers. So before I begin, I'd just like to give a big shout out and a big thank you to Homegrown for acknowledging the importance of building systems and services to really support family childcare. This webinar today has been designed to support programs who are current Head Start grantees, or for those who are very familiar with the Head Start performance standards, and really want to add a family childcare option to their services and their budgets to better meet the needs of children, families, and providers. So hopefully today we'll be able to provide some useful information and foster your interest in pursuing this approach. Could I have the next slide, please? So let's start with kind of an overview of the content of this webinar. First, we'd like to tell you a little bit about how the grant is built and why, give you a brief synopsis of the model, components, talk about layered funding and the cost drivers for this model, and finally provide strategies for incorporating family childcare into your plans. Our goal is to provide a few tips and pointers to help you develop a winning proposal. So we really do have a lot of ground to cover today. So there'll be slides throughout this presentation. We'll just skim over or only reference a couple points when we feel that the rest of the information is fairly universal to the field. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. If we don't respond during the webinar, we'll either respond in writing or discuss the topic at a scheduled technical assistance call. So next slide, please. So I want to start off with the poll. And so here's the question. Where would you rate your current knowledge of the regulations related to the family childcare option contained in the Head Start performance standards? And I think the poll will read no knowledge, somewhat, or expert. So if you just go ahead and kind of place yourself in one of those categories, we'd appreciate it. Oh, good. It looks like we have some almost experts and some with no knowledge and some in between, which is great. So we're kind of have a great mix. So the good news is no matter where you placed yourself on this scale, there's so many supports out there ready to assist you to help you incorporate family childcare into your planning. You know, Head Start has the Early Childhood Learning and Knowledge Center. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. We refer to it as ECLEC, which has about anything you'd want to know about these partnerships. Homegrown has done an amazing job really developing a resource library for you. They're planning technical assistance calls with some exemplar programs from across the United States. And they've also compiled a bank of experienced grant writers should you need one. So there's really no need to worry. There's a lot of supports out there for you. Next slide, please. So a little bit of history on how this came to be, these Early Head Start childcare partnership model was developed. And it really came together as a collaboration between two entities. One is the Office of Child Care, one is the Office of Head Start. Both offices knew that less than 10% of low-income infants and toddlers were enrolled in quality learning environments that adequately supported their success in public school. So they really wanted to significantly increase that number and really expand services. So what they did is really kind of put their heads together, and they really wanted to ensure that all children in a provider's care had access to higher quality, even though only some were enrolled in the Early Head Start Child Care Partnership. They wanted, obviously, to ensure, as I said, they wanted to serve more. And equally as important, the offices identified that they wanted to sustain and increase the number of successful small businesses. And these goals are very important to today's discussion because for the very first time, if you'll look on page 2 of the grant of the funding opportunity announcement, for the very first time, the grant focuses on the importance of family child care networks and encourages communities and partners to really band together to increase access to resources and administrative efficiencies for child care providers. What they've basically done with this is that they've realized and they've acknowledged that the child care field is in peril, the family child care field is in peril and needs additional support to reverse a downward trend in numbers. According to a recent report from the National Center on the Early Childhood Quality, between 2005 and 2017, there was a 52% decrease in small family homes. Small family homes means that the provider is working alone without additional staff. The decrease in the number of providers really represents a 40% decrease in enrollment opportunities for children. It also equates to a 51% decrease in the participation of the Child Care Development Block Grant Fund, which we refer to as CCDF, which assists low-income families who are working and are going to school. It helps them pay for childcare. So it's really easy to imagine why low-income families are struggling to find quality, affordable childcare. Without expansion, many will not be able to enter or re-enter the workforce. I think we have witnessed this in real time over the past few months with many top-level and community leaders finally understanding how childcare is an important component of economic health. And family childcare is an essential service to families. So it's really encouraging that the federal government is elevating the importance of family childcare and thinking about, really wanting us all to think about innovative approaches to build the supply and quality of services and improve provider compensation and workforce supports for families. Next slide, please. The only challenge that the offices had was how to fund a broader net of childcare providers to meet the Head Start program performance standards. The offices soon realized, though, if they could braid and blend Head Start funds with childcare funds, they could sustain childcare providers and use Head Start's well-established systems to provide resources and technical assistance to help community providers meet the Head Start standards. So what they designed is the expansion opportunities called Early Head Start Child Care Partnerships that complies with the Head Start performance standards, but really is focused on full-day, year-round programs that use research-based curriculum and that offer high quality and developmentally appropriate indoor and outdoor learning environments, programs that offer comprehensive services that focus on the whole child, including health, care and learning environments that are staffed by highly skilled caregivers with access to coaching and professional development supports, and services to assist families in access to the resources and referrals to enhance family health and well-being. And I think one of the authors of this program, her name is Linda Smith, best describes it and best really talks about some of the outcomes. So we're gonna stop here and have a 2-minute video.
It goes without saying that in today's economy, childcare is a real issue for our families and finding affordable quality childcare, especially for infants and toddlers. So what has happened with the Early Head Start Childcare Partnerships is they have expanded access to high quality care for our families, which is a really important thing out there for families today. Nationwide, about 275 Head Start grantees are partnering with childcare providers across this country. And that is leading to higher quality for all of these programs. The programs who partner get access to a whole bunch of supports, such as training, equipment, supplies, etc., that improve the quality of their programs and bring them up to the early Head Start performance standards, which is a really important thing. So what we're trying to do is to ensure that families have access and that the providers themselves who are in these partnerships have a higher level of income, and they get roughly twice as much money if they're in these partnerships as they would if they were only in the child care subsidy program. So it's a win-win for both of them. Well, the partnerships matter because it expands access to high quality child care for so many families. The partnerships are serving over 30,000 additional infants and toddlers in this country, and more because the other children in the rooms with the Head Start children are getting better quality as well. So for example, a teacher who has taken the training and has access to better equipment and curriculums actually offers that to more children than just those children that are enrolled in this program. So the numbers are much bigger than that, and that's really important for some of our families out there.
We want families.
So as you heard, I mean, Linda is really the one that gave us our marching orders for this program and very wisely really worked diligently to ensure that the program could be expanded into community childcare settings. So we owe her a great big thank you. Could I have the next slide, please?
Happy.
Why don't we skip? Can I have the next one, please? I think Linda covered a lot of this in her presentation. Okay, so as a current grantee, there's no doubt you're very familiar with the Head Start Systems Management Wheel. And knowing that you're familiar with its components, I'm not really going to go over those components today, but we thought it might be helpful throughout this presentation if we would highlight specific areas of the wheel that could be woven throughout the 6 sections of your grant proposal. You know, I always found it really helpful to keep this wheel next to me as I was writing grants, because I knew that reviewers would be scrutinizing the narrative for my approach to incorporating family child care into its systems and services. So we're going to really start today by talking about section 6, believe it or not, budget and budget justification. And the reason we're doing that is because as you write your narrative for the other 5 sections, you'll need to be noting the budget ramifications. Reviewers will be looking very specifically at your budget and looking for the types of resources and the amount of resources outlined in your budget that will go directly to supporting family child care. And a big piece of writing this grant is understanding how the layered funding works to help you determine appropriate expenses for this grant. As a Head Start grantee, you know how important it is that an allowable and appropriate cost allocation is very important. So in this program, however, appropriate cost allocation is not quite as easily identified as in non-partnerships, and really is not as clear cut. So I'd like to go over a few scenarios here that will kind of help us determine what is allowable and what is not. But first, we're going to start with a description of the 3 layers of funding. Could I have the next slide, please? So there are really 3 layers, or buckets as we call them, of supports that can be offered. You know, some are paid by child care revenues, other by the Early Head Start Child Care Partnership funds. The first layer, which is the very core layer, you'll see there on layer 1, see the arrow. This is the foundational layer. And these are funds that the provider is already receiving to operate from either a child care subsidy or a private pay family. These funds cannot be supplanted by grant funds. These funds have to be expended as they are and cannot be supplanted. The second layer is called program level enhancements. And this is where the partnership, this grant funds will pay for program level comprehensive services required in the Head Start performance standards. These services benefit all children regardless of whether they're enrolled in the Early Head Start Child Care Partnership Program or not. Some of the examples of what that funding looks like or could be used for is staff training to meet the Head Start performance standards, increased staffing levels to meet child care staff ratios, equipment and supplies, minor facility improvements to meet health and safety needs, and parent training. Now there's a long list of these. Those I just offer those as a few so you can see what the program level enhancements look like. The third layer is the individual child service layer. Again, Early Head Start Child Care Partnerships pay for these services for children who are only enrolled in the Early Head Start Child Care Partnership. They're individual child services. Some examples would be, referrals to outside agencies, assigned family service workers and visits, home visits, infant formula and diapers, because as you know, while they're in service, the grant provides for the diapers and formula. So that is the third layer. It's only the children enrolled in the program are eligible. So now let's try out, now that we've got those three definitions, let's try out a few of examples of what cost allocation could look like. So if I can have the next slide, please. So here's the first scenario, and we're going to do a poll. So a family child care provider home has just become an Early Head Start Child Care Partnership partner and will require a few minor facility renovations to ensure the safety of children and meet the Head Start performance standards. The provider is serving 4 Early Head Start Child Care Partnership children and 4 private pay families. So the question is, how should renovation costs be handled? Will Early Head Start pay for all of the renovation costs, or does it need to be allocated? Oh, we're almost split, pretty close, 50-50, right around there. Well, the correct answer is that the Early Head Start Child Care Partnership grant will pay for all of the renovation costs without allocation required. As long as Early Head Start Child Care Partnership children benefit from the renovations, cost allocation is not required, even when the other children in the care environment also benefit. This would be called, that would be your layer 2 services that we talked about. So let's try another one. Next slide, please. Head Start requires that formula and diapers be provided for the partnership children while in care. A family child care provider buys diapers for all 6 children in her care. 3 of the 6 children are enrolled in Early Head Start Child Care Partnerships. The provider orders 300 diapers at a cost of $300. Can all of the expenses be charged to the Early Head Start Child Care Partnership grant? Yes or no? You are absolutely correct. You've got that one. They cannot be charged because it is an individual service and it belongs in layer 3. Well, you guys catch on quick. That's great. Okay, let's try one more. Next slide, please. Okay, the grantee and family child care provider agree that all 6 children in the provider's care will receive sensory and developmental screenings. 3 of the children are enrolled in the Early Head Start Child Care Partnership program. Can the Early Head Start Child Care Partnerships funds pay for the cost of all screenings? So we have yes, they can pay for all, no, it must be allocated, or maybe. Wow, 33, 33, and 33. Good. Well, you're all right, really. You are really all, right, because the answer really here is maybe, and it depends. In some cases it can be, some cases it can. And so if the sensory and developmental screenings are necessary for curriculum implementation, for all enrolled children, such as when enrolled children are observed interacting with non-enrolled children, the basic screenings are considered a program level enhancement, level 2 service, and chargeable to the grant. However, if the purpose of the screening, it was a more advanced screening and related to referrals that was related to an individual child's need, they're considered layer 3, and they could not be charged to the Early Head Start Child Care Partnership Award. So I know when my organization received its first Early Head Start Child Care Partnership grant, we had so many questions about cost allocation and allowable expenses, even though we've been a grantee for decades. So I urge you to keep these definitions and the definitions of these layers close as you form the descriptions of services and allocate expenses. Believe me, trust me, you're going to need them. Next slide, please. So there are a few other points I'd like to stress here as they will impact your budget. And the first is group size and ratios. In this partnership, one provider alone can care for a maximum of 6 children with no more than 2 children under the age of 2. A provider with an assistant can care for a maximum of 12 children with no more than 4 infants, toddlers, and only 2 under the age of 18 months. So depending upon your state licensing regulations, this can be a challenge for family child care providers, as often their primary caregiving role is much greater than those allowed in the Head Start performance standards. If meeting this standard requires a reduction in group size or hiring additional staff, it is necessary to build these costs into your budget, along with additional supports for quality. The second is continuity of care. Head Start has long recognized the importance of continuity of care for children enrolled in Head Start programs. In this program, once a child is enrolled, they cannot be removed from service due to a parent's loss of a child care subsidy. Usually this is only for a limited time as your staff works with families to reinstate the child care subsidy. But in the meantime, your budget needs to ensure that there are funds available for providers to cover the cost of the child care subsidy losses for children enrolled in the Early Head Start Child Care Partnership Program. It's about keeping the providers' payments whole. Another thing I'd like to say is that, just mention, is that the funds follow the child. Funds allocated to a family child care provider are directly tied generally to the number of children, Early Head Start Child Care Partnership children that provider is enrolling. For example, if you opt to pay a provider a designated amount per enrolled child, you should consider what your minimum number is for the number of children in each provider's home. The more providers you support, the more your infrastructure has to be expanded. Now, I know the rule of thumb that I always used to use was a minimum of 2 children in a family child care home. And that's because if one child for some reason left unexpectedly, the provider could continue to receive services because they always have to have at least 1 child enrolled. So that's why my rule was 2, but the standards really say a child. And the last is non-federal share. And I just want to stress that you as the grantee, not the family child care partners, are responsible for capturing non-federal share. Now, this does not mean that the family child care providers don't help you with that and secure resources, only that you're responsible for making it happen. And I have a couple of examples here that will help. Number one is the space in the family child care home. You can have that space appraised, and that can be counted as non-federal share to your grant. The other, and one of my favorites that I used to have, is I was secured private funds, because if you remember, continuity of care is one of the objectives of this grant. So I use private funds to cover parents' fees and childcare subsidy when they lost their childcare subsidy. And because it was to meet the objectives of the grant, it was an allowable expense. So it could always help you keep the program whole, revenues whole. Can I have the next slide, please? This slide is really about your partnership agreements and your partnerships. The first decision you really need to make is what type of agreement you will be entering into. A delegate or a subrecipient or a contractual relationship. In most cases, when you're working with an individual family child care provider, it will be a contractual relationship. But if, for example, you wanted to work with a family child care network and just pass through funds to them to meet the Head Start performance standards, you're more likely in a delegate or a subrecipient arrangement. The definitions of all these definitions can be found in parts 45 CFR, part 75 of the Uniform Guidance if you need further definition. So because individual partners will be at very, very different stages of readiness to meet the standards, ongoing conversations will need to occur long before these partnership agreements are being written, and I would say jointly written, because these partnership agreements are really an important piece of authentic collaborations. It really creates and defines the programmatic and financial relationships you have. And I will say again, the relationship should be developed in collaboration with providers and individualized to address the unique needs of each provider. So beyond detailing programmatic expectations, which Carol will talk about in a minute, fiscal agreements need to be clearly defined. You will need to include things like service levels, payment arrangements, and timeframes with reporting requirements. If you are including specific supports for facility renovations or specific supports for professional development for staff qualifications, or if you're reducing child-staff ratios, these really should be spelled out in this agreement. The last point I want to make about the agreements is to make sure you're thinking about record keeping and reporting requirements, because they also should be addressed in the agreement. And this is one area that's going to require a lot of thought on the grantees' part. Family child care providers often work alone, and their attention is always directed towards the children. Head Start, as you all know, is very documentation heavy. So for family child care, you really need to think about how to integrate the grant's reporting requirements into multi-purpose and seamless processes. You can't just simply take your current system and drop them into their settings. Modifications will definitely need to be made. So with that said, we're going to move on to the next sections of the grant. I hope this first section has provided a few tips, and now I'm going to turn it over to Carol.
Great. And before Carol gets on, I'm just going to jump in here for 1 second and encourage folks to share their questions in the chat or the Q&A. We can address those throughout the conversation and save them for the end or address them in writing. But we'd love to hear what questions are popping up for you as you listen to the presentation. Thanks, Carol.
Great. Thanks, Natalie. Well, good afternoon. I'm Carol Kynes. I was a former Head Start director and also actually directed family child care networks. So I know some of the things that are going on, but it's been a while and things have changed drastically in the last few years. So I hope that between Kathy and I, we were able to provide you with some useful information that will help you write a successful early Head Start partnership grant, and that grant will leverage the largely untapped resources of family childcare in the communities that we serve. So beginning with this communications slide, we placed it at the beginning of my section really to describe what a dynamic culture will occur if you use thoughtful communication to support implementation of this proposal and actually of any of the organizational grants and programs that you have within your Head Start program. This pyramid that you're looking at describes effective communication strategies that we use to create authentic collaborations. That's at the top of the pyramid model. That's what we want to go to, where we want to be. And these are really difficult collaborations to establish, but they're critical for partnerships to be able to survive. Authentic partnerships include characteristics such as a commitment to building, nurturing, and maintaining that mutually benefit relationship, joint responsibility and accountability for success, and sharing of resources and rewards, and sometimes accountability and sharing in the risk, because there's always risks to the things that we try to do, especially new risks included in grant. But if we don't try or change, and we will never be able to move forward. And so we always say that risks is how we change and how we make course corrections. So then thinking about how to nurture relationships. So relationships are nurtured based upon mutual trust and respect. Each voice is responsible to the partnership and must play a role in joint decision-making with power differentials acknowledged and negotiated. And that's where, again, Kathy was mentioning partnership agreements. That's where you articulate what everyone's role is within those partnership agreements. Well, I'll talk about that later, but they're really sort of two parts. So Kathy talked about the fiscal part of it, and later I'll talk about the programmatic part. But there's bound to be conflict and stress in these dynamic collaborations because there's a lot going on when you're trying to implement Head Start performance standards with new partners. However, when all partners are respectfully open, transparent, and honest about expectations, issues that arise can be managed together. Okay, I just kind of blew by the honesty and transparency comment, but this is really a difficult level to achieve. And you really, what I found was sometimes messages are really hard to give to folks when they're not things that they want to hear. So they need to be respectfully given so that your relationship with the provider honors the fact that you will always be honest in your praise, as well as honest in your support for change. Everyone has something significant to contribute to the collaboration, including time, knowledge, expertise, and funds, with each partner bringing different resources to the table. Be willing to recognize each other's strengths and assets, but also openly acknowledge and work to strengthen the areas that require improvement. Authentic collaborations require, and that's at the top of the pyramid if we get there, a commitment of time, including scheduled face time and times during the beginning of any change. Finding and using the partner's favorite and most effective way of communicating, and then using it. Next, be sure that the network staffing structure that you create within your budget and within this grant proposal has enough time to include that special time to foster these collaborative communications, and that communication occurs between all levels of your organizational chart, your board of directors, your policy council, the community, and importantly, between family child care providers as well. An implementation tip for this grant is to perhaps build in stipends for the providers during the startup phase of the grant and throughout maybe the first 12 months to allow for training on how this grant will impact the provider's program. And begin communication on the very first day of implementation in a planned way. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, this is our favorite management systems wheel. You already saw it once, but we're bringing it back. The reason we do this is we want you to think about how you would manage the changes in your organization and what the management system needs to look like based on the impact of this grant. Think about including the management wheel pieces in all of the criteria, and think about the barriers that Kathy mentioned earlier to family child care providers operating their programs within this wheel. I mean, just think about it. If you've never seen this wheel before, and maybe some of you have, but most of you probably have, someone who's operating a program has been doing it for years, and then you say to them, take a look at this wheel. We want you to operate within it. So you can see where we might want to step back and give the provider opportunity to ask a lot of questions and use that first year to really provide for time for the provider to ask questions and be engaged. The grant application has 6 criteria areas that you'll need to address if you want to receive the maximum points, and you do. Based on the strength of your proposal in those areas, the reader will give you a certain number of points. As Head Start grantees, you know probably that very well, and that the same questions are often in all of the proposals that are very similar. But this FOA and the categories that have been proposed are a little difficult to unpack, where to include all the comprehensive services outlined in this wheel. So again, keeping the wheel close, making sure that you check off everything is important. When we get done in the next section, when we get done here, what we want to do actually is break down the criteria and discuss what you might want to include. And so the next slides contain a box to the right of the narrative, and it's labeled questions to think about. Well, you got it. It's questions to think about. Please use the chat box as Natalie described for questions about any of those questions to think about that are in that little box on the side of the slide. Also, you'll notice that some criteria have 2 slides, some criteria 1 slide. Remember, you can decide what you think best describes your program and put the information in different sections. What really matters is that you include all the information to support implementing a comprehensive early Head Start childcare partnership model. Okay, are there any questions on that? No, looks good. So next slide, please. The next 2 slides describe the community need and objective criteria. The first criteria in the FOA is the acronym for the application process, is community needs. This section and the next program design section represent almost 50% of the grant total points. I'm not going to read the slides to you as you can see them for yourselves, but I will be offering topics that you may or may not want to include in your narrative. I've also bolded a few barriers that may come up when you're working with family childcare providers that you may want to consider and discuss in your narratives. In this section, you can use your community needs assessment. Be sure to provide data on the number of infants and toddlers not being served, and include pregnant mothers if there is significant data that show a gap in services in your community. Remember, don't include random data. Keep your data focused on the project's goals and objectives. Then discuss how you will or have been utilizing your board of directors, policy council, health advisory committee, and other community partners to evaluate data for your targeted service areas and avoid duplication of services. New in this FOA is analyzing childcare and subsidy data to justify your selection of the service areas, including service delivery options and childcare for parents who are working, going to school, or in training programs. So this is new in the grant, but it's not been a new piece for your community needs assessment. So you should be able to pull some of that data from that. Also in this section, you'll need to indicate if, as Kathy mentioned, if you're going to be using a delegate model. If you are, you will want to outline what that program will look like and what services are provided by the grantee and what services you're expecting the delegate to be responsible for. Okay, let me just look in that chat box. So what about new grantees? Oh, you're in South Carolina. I'm actually from South Carolina. I live in the Beaufort area. Yeah, you can definitely apply as a new grantee. I think United Way of Miami is a Head Start grantee, so that might be a good resource for you as well. All right, shall we move to the next slide in this criteria? One of the strategies in this criteria that's really helpful and really needs to be included is using a map of the service area. You should start today, if you're thinking about writing for this grant, with designing your map, because this map can end up as a terrible distraction at the end of the grant writing period. It just gets to be so cumbersome. Be sure to think carefully about your design. The FOA has highlighted opportunity zones so that you can even include those in your map. You can shade it in. Unfortunately, again, they're not giving any extra points for that, but it does show that you're serving one of the most needy areas in your community. You might also want to shade the high areas of poverty and placing each one of your partners on the map and indicating the zip codes or census tracts where they fall. This makes identifying the partners easier in your narrative. You'll want to describe your strategy also for selecting partners and forging new collaborations with community resources. Utilizing a list of criteria as to what your program will need to make your proposal successful and to recruit families with subsidy needing childcare support. This can show the reader your intentionality to meet the requirements of this FOA. Another suggestion would be to leverage your PIR data over time. And what that is for folks that aren't Head Start grantees, it's a report that you provide annually to Head Start with demographic statistics on your program. Also, if you have early Head Start children on subsidy, that an analysis that you could provide with information, including when families were unable to maintain subsidies, is a great thing to include, and also suggest the possible barriers that some of your families ran into when they were trying to maintain their childcare subsidy. So this is one of my first questions in Think About box. If you look at the Think About box. So think about when selecting partners, is there a match? What does the provider bring to the program and what will the provider need? Okay, now I also have a poll question for you. Karen, can you put up the poll question? On a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very little and 5 being very knowledgeable, please answer, how well do you know the needs of family childcare providers in your community? Oh, that's great. That's really important, because if you're going to be including providers, you really need to know who they are. And you need to figure out which of those providers have private pay or are using subsidy with their families. because the benefits of private pay are often better than some of the third-party payments from subsidies. Okay,
Carol?
yeah.
There is a question in the chat box. I wonder if you have a second to address this question. It's from Tasha, and she asks, is it best to know in advance who your family childcare partners will be, or can you propose to seek them out during your first year of funding?
You can do that. So you can write in your grant that you're going to seek out providers, but you will need to demonstrate that you have really strong links with those providers. In most of the grants, what I would suggest is that you look for providers that you can talk with and ask if they'd be willing to be a partner in this grant. What can happen is at the end of the grant period, and let's say you receive the grant and these partners have agreed, then you go back to the partners and you sort of revisit their partnership agreements, and they may at that point say they don't want to join, or they have an idea for someone else to join. So although you need to have a firm idea, or the best grant, the most points you will get is if you really have those providers solidly in place. But in reality, after, I don't know, it'll be 6 months once you submit your grant, that the providers might not be willing to do it at that point. So the answer is, yes, you can say, I'm going to seek providers in a certain area, and I know these providers because they're connected with us already, but we have, not say you have a commitment, but in general, they're interested. But a more successful grant will actually identify those providers and identify specifics about them, which ones have subsidy, etc. So that's that.
And Carol, if I could just add, I would offer to the group, if you, we would be happy to help you connect with networks in your area if we have relationships with them. So on the resource page, there's kind of a question area where you can submit for questions and supports. If you'd like us to help you connect with networks or CCR&Rs or folks who are working with family childcare in your area, we'd be happy to try and help you. We may have relationships in those areas and be able to connect you with either providers or organizations that work with providers. Thanks for taking that question, Carol.
Yeah, it's a really good one because it's really hard to talk with providers when you're writing this grant and you don't really have anything firm that you can offer them. You can say, we're thinking about this, but we don't know if we're going to be awarded. So it's a little nebulous. Okay, let's see. Next slide, please. Program design. Yep, there we go. Okay, before we get started on suggesting the narrative under this criteria, it's important to note that in the grant specifically, it suggests using, as Natalie was speaking about, a network of providers. Again, unfortunately, they didn't award any extra points for that. And what they said in the FOA was developing family childcare providers and building networks in communities with a shortage of childcare. Innovative approaches can increase the supply of high quality early care and education in the community. There's more to that statement, and you can find it really within the FOA. It's actually on page 9. But you should consider this model because they are putting it out there. I mean, they added it in this grant for a specific reason. So you know that they're looking to fund some programs that do provide this model. Okay, for those of you that are already grantees, you probably have a process and a plan in place for establishing and measuring school readiness goals. For the purposes of this application, you'll want to go back into section 1, which was the community needs section, where you were getting information about what your community looks like and take information. Just pull little snippets of information from that piece to show that your school readiness goals are culturally and linguistically aligned with your community. It's also important to discuss your transition plan for children. Head Start children don't always transition well, and we need to make sure that families and children have the resources and the supports in creating smooth transition for families into other childcare. Sometimes programs are bigger, they look different, maybe they have desks. So sometimes children need support in meeting with teachers in front of their transitions. And you need to develop in your grant sort of a transition plan, or develop a transition plan or a system for making sure that those transitions do occur as seamlessly as possible. And that's into Head Start programs or pre-K. I know we're talking about infants and toddlers, but you also need to include that information in your grant application. And then another big issue that's yet to be resolved between the two federal departments, and Kathy talked a little bit about this, is the misalignments of regulation for both family child care and center-based care in the area of staff to child ratios and group sizes. Kathy outlined those regulations for you and suggested one way to handle that using budgets and funding for the providers. OHS, or the Office of Head Start, has also suggested another idea that you might want to include in your plan. And that suggestion is that when you're in a community where you have higher income levels, just a note, the federal poverty guidelines have really not kept pace with the communities. The suggestion is that you can maximize your enrollment possibilities by extending your eligibility exemptions to between 100 and 130% of federal poverty, and using that 10% for over income to improve your program's recruitment of working families with subsidies, especially, as I said, in communities with higher income levels, which is just about everywhere. Okay, Natalie, the next slide, please. So continuing with program design and approach, you will need to describe a realistic time frame for implementation, providing ongoing training for family childcare providers in how to use the curriculum will really take time. The training should be broken into segments so the providers are comfortable using the curriculum. And before you begin measuring progress toward your school readiness goals, you might want to think about using some of the new digital trackers that are available, and tools such as those should be considered, as some providers may not have used a formal curriculum before. And those tools are really helpful in supporting them in tracking child assessments and using the curriculum. And the tools also help make the reporting less stressful on the provider a little bit and more accurate and timely. Discuss in your narrative how you will support children with disabilities and what training you will have for providers and who may also be enrolling children that are part of the child welfare system. Maybe they're dual language learners, maybe they're homeless. These are all big jobs for providers to include these really vulnerable children into their homes. So the network may want to take the lead in completing the screenings and the follow-up, at least in the beginning of the grant period. And information about these screenings and follow-up should be included in a parent handbook that you may want to create just for the Head Start parents, or as an addendum to the provider's parent handbook. The narrative also should include a plan for sustaining those quality providers. There's actually a question in the grant about this. You should provide how you will do that. What resources will you direct toward these providers to help them stay serving Head Start children. The narrative should also provide a plan for transitioning in or out a new provider partner and what additional services or training will be needed by that provider. Okay, are there any questions from Stacy? If the provider is receiving a child care subsidy, but it doesn't cover the entire attendance fee, can the grant funding cover the amount that is not covered by the subsidy? Yes, yes, as long as they're early Head Start enrolled children and qualify, that's exactly what the grant does. It will provide each family child care home with a specific amount of a specific amount of funding to support you in helping that child meet all the, helping the child and the family and you meet all the Head Start regulations. So absolutely, that's really true. Kathy just wrote to say that the grant can also pay additional stipends to support the program quality. There's lots of ways of weaving in that Head Start funding so that it goes directly to the provider as well. But as the grantee has to manage the program, you want to make sure that you have sufficient funding to be able to implement that provider, because you're going to need to add staff and systems to your organization. Okay, I have a little poll. If you could put that up, Karen, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very difficult and 5 being really easy, could you answer this question? How difficult do you think it will be for family child care providers to implement a research-based curriculum? And maybe some of you already have had that experience. So that would be interesting as well. But be honest about your own organization and the level of implementation, even within your own organizations. I know when I ran a Head Start program, we had different levels of teachers being able to implement the curriculum. So it looks like actually a lot of you are really ready to support the family child care providers in implementing the curriculum. Just be sure that it's carefully done and that providers have enough time to really understand what the criteria are that they're looking at in their observations of children. Okay, the next slide for staffing. Thanks, Karen. In this piece of the grant, under the criteria staffing, which is criteria 3, we suggest you describe how Head Start educational minimum qualifications for teachers and family child care providers and grantee management and leadership staff will be met during startup, or you need to specify a time frame within your grant proposal. Teachers and providers must have competencies for planning and implementing a curriculum that supports children to maximize their learning experiences and ensures that developmental levels and children's interests are included in the decision for designing activities. As a grantee, your staff must meet all those education and experience requirements to convince the reader that you are able to provide full implementation for that Head Start programming in family child care homes. Okay, so then you also in this section want to describe why these requirements for staff are important. For example, family child care providers who are trained to use the focused curriculum and teaching strategies, research tells us, will be able to advance the intellectual, physical development of children, including improving the readiness of children for school by developing their literacy, phonemic awareness, and understanding and use of language. Their appreciation of books, their understanding of early math and early science, and their problem-solving abilities and their approaches to learning. You can find descriptions like this on eClick. And eClick, for those of you who aren't Head Start, is the website for Head Start. It's the Early Childhood Learning and Knowledge Center. And it's in the resource library that you'll be provided with from Homegrown. So anyway, you can find little vignettes like this that you can just lift out, move the words around a little bit and tenses to make it fit, and it can describe what you're going to be expecting from your staff. Again, this expectation of this section is to demonstrate your understanding of the importance of these requirements and plan to ensure that all your staff meet these requirements, including hiring and sustaining staff. So you want to talk about that. You want to look at your annual reviews and professional development plans and how you're going to create those together with providers and how that will fully support that quality improvement of your new program in all the programming aspects. One of the think about questions that asks about how your systems will support implementation of this program. So what that means is, how are you going to be leveraging your staff and thinking about what that plan would look like? Who's going to be in charge? What human resource systems are you proposing to use? Are you going to hire and sustain the qualified staff that you have? And be sure that you include how you're going to support your partners in this ongoing learning process. So those are some things in the think about question box for you to think about. All right. I don't see anything new, so I'm just going to move to the next slide, please. So this is criteria 4. So criteria 4 asks you to talk about planning and implementation. Although discussion of the Head Start program performance standards and implementation strategies are really important here, this is where you want to show some reflection on the barriers that will be faced by family child care providers if you're proposing that model. Because providers, when they are committed to enrolling low-income at-risk children, really will follow through. But there are providers, maybe, I mean, well, think about it, you know, you're asking that they take 2 of their highly sought after slots and take a chance on this program. So you want to really make sure that you're clear with providers what is going on in this program, and providers who are committed, even though maybe they might have some challenges, would be a better selection for you than a highly functioning family child care provider that's high in quality and really has a research-based curriculum. But if they're not committed, this is a really tough ask for family child care providers. And be sure that you vet your selection of providers carefully. I hope I didn't scare you away, but it's just really important to look at all the attributes and think about what the best provider is. And that best provider may not be the one that checks off all the boxes in your quality rating scale. All right, you also want to include in this section that it speaks to your provider's licensing status, and also you want to include some protocols probably that discusses how licensing findings would be reported to you. And again, to this point of this question, you will, if you want to think about how you will effectively monitor Head Start in all these different locations, in different family child care models, So you want to talk about how you think successes will be accomplished and what concerns you might be thinking about. For example, one of the things that the grant application talks about is if you're purchasing or renting facilities. And this is the section where you want to provide a specific timeline with completed activities, down to the detail of obtaining permits and required licensing. So remember, again, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but there is a 12-month window for this grant for obtaining full enrollment. So whatever the number of children you agreed to enroll in your Early Head Start partnership, you need to have that enrollment completed within 12 months after you receive your grant. The plan also must include how the networks will support the provider and how the provider is involved in that recruitment of the families currently receiving subsidies. And that is, again, a question or information that should be included and agreed to in the provider agreement. There is a question in this criteria, again, whenever you look at grant applications, when there are like these little specific questions for the model that you're proposing, you want to be sure that you answer those fully. And the question is, again, for applicants that are proposing an Early Head Start childcare partnership, and that question asks the applicant's ability to work with partners to ensure accountability for meeting Head Start program performance standards across multiple sites. So you want to include in your discussion or in the staffing section more detail about, for example, the number of coaches, family engagement staff that will be needed to support your family childcare providers. Look at the geographic locations. How is monitoring going to happen? How will your nutrition specialists, health specialists, nurses, disabilities or behavior experts and others integrate into all of the providers' homes, and so that providers feel like they're not intruding, but they're there to help and support them. Information like this that I just talked about, the number of coaches, how you're doing your monitoring, and disabilities, that information is also likely to show, that information request from the FOA is also likely to show up in other criteria sections. Be sure to cross-reference whenever you can. Okay, next slide, provider agreements. Kathy talked about this mostly in terms of the fiscal responsibilities, but this slide, I hope, highlights for you some other important aspects of the provider agreement that you may wish to include. I'm sure there would be others, but you want to include these within your proposed model. And they're all important, but again, to Kathy's point, the first bullet on this slide is probably the most important. If your provider is really not all in, and even if they're a fantastically organized, successful, high-quality provider, unfortunately, the heavy lift of becoming a Head Start program might be too big without that strong commitment, and you may lose that provider. So you want to, those are things that you really need to think about. And look again at the questions to think about. And there's the barrier that I talked about earlier about the Head Start child ratios and how you can figure that out. That is a really important point when you're trying to recruit providers into your proposal. Okay, next slide. So the last two slides talk about organizational infrastructure and management systems. And this is really about the governance as part of your organizational infrastructure. And this is the section where you'll discuss how you'll be modifying your program, your policy council, adding reporting requirements for the new grant into board reports, and as needed, add discussion on how you're going to sustain and train the providers, and how your staff is going to be respectfully interacting and providing support. A useful tool here that I highlighted is to use your early learning outcomes framework, or as we fondly call it, the ELOF. We have all kinds of acronyms in Head Start. It's sort of a fun language. So providing information on the development of your ELOF and changes that you will need to make to that outcomes framework should be reflected in your proposed program. And using this framework will also demonstrate your program's knowledge of systems and organization management that's required in Head Start. Again, remember, this is a process. This implementation process is over a 5-year period. So you want to provide both training plans and monitoring plans, probably just over the first 2 years, and use, if you can, or you would like to, a rubric of annual and quarterly approvals. Again, it demonstrates your ability to implement and provide support for family childcare providers to really become the Head Start programs that this grant is hoping for. So next slide, Karen. Continuing in this section, the reader is really looking for a proposal that's more robust at providing oversight of this innovative approach. If you're proposing this approach, use innovative approach little snippets all throughout your grant to keep reminding the reader that you're providing this high quality, comprehensive service program for early Head Start with children in family childcare. So talk about it not just here, but continually throughout. There is significantly, just a point of reference, there's significantly less funding in this 4th round for early Head Start childcare partnerships. So your proposal hopefully will catch the reader's attention by including a model of networking with providers. But you want to be sure to impress the reader with the program that you're providing that will be responsive and accessible to children with working families with the greatest needs in your community. And as importantly, that you are authentically engaging parents, thinking about that communication pyramid in your proposal. This ensures children's learning will be supported by their families, really even after they leave Head Start. And describing how continuity of care is also important in these guidelines, as children cannot be removed from this program if they lose their subsidy. So in other words, the child would then only be supported with your Head Start funding and not with the subsidy. And this is where you as a program will want to set up some funds that can be available to family childcare providers to access if families do fall off of childcare subsidy. And this is really critical in your planning for the financial health of your proposal. Okay, so let's go to the last poll. On a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being little confidence and 5 being very confident, please answer this question about how confident you are that you can develop systems to assure accountability in these partnerships. So think about the strategies we talked about, including the communication, keeping relationships strong, but also helping providers understand the importance of reporting. So things to kind of think about. Oh, this is great. Look at you, even the people that are in the middle. So you're sort of confident that you can have those systems. That means that you're probably already a pretty high performing Head Start grantee. And so you're going to be able to leverage all of those systems to help you make sure that the children that will be newly enrolled in these providers' homes are going to get all the services that you're also providing through your grant. Okay, now I'm going to go to my takeaway slide. So this is my takeaway slide. What I wanted you to think about, and I actually copied this from a webinar that I was on, and I kind of liked it because as I went away from the webinar, sometimes you forget what you've been thinking about. So what I would like you to do is think about the 4 critical steps that you need to take immediately if you're writing for this grant. Because as you know, it's going to be due on September 21st. And that means you have to have the grant loaded in on September 21st. So as Head Start programs know, you want to get it loaded in at least a couple days in advance because there's always a big backup on the internet. If you want to add some of those ideas to the chat box, that would be great. Otherwise, you can just take this home with you and think about what you want to do. So I want to thank you, Homegrown, again for providing this vision of incorporating family childcare because in truth, that's where some of the best relationships with children occur. And again, research tells us that children learn best when they trust and feel comfortable in a learning environment. And that relationship that family childcare providers bring to the table, not only with the child, but with the family, is really something strong that can be built on. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Natalie.
Thank you so much, Carol. And thank you to Kathy as well for this really rich presentation. You know, our hope is to kind of get you started and get you thinking about how you might include home-based providers in your grant as you think about expansion. But we have lots of other ways that we'd like to, you know, support you if this is a direction that you head in. So we have compiled a number of resources on our website at the web address that is on the screen here, and that we are dropping in the chat for you. There are lots of documents and articles and videos and all kinds of things there. In addition, in the resource library, there is a list of grant writers and consultants that are available to support you know, you with your application and various other items. In addition to these webinars, we held one last week for new grantees or prospective grantees, this one for existing grantees. Both of these webinars will be recorded and posted to that resource site, but we will also be holding a few technical assistance sessions where we will sort of both provide supports, but really have a more open forum for answering questions and also for highlighting peer exemplars and for peer-to-peer support. So we're planning a number of these over, you know, from now until September 21st. But the next 2 that we have planned that you can register for on the website right now is one later this week, really focused on sort of those external partnerships. And I think I saw a really good comment about this, but kind of engaging providers and starting to kind of discuss this opportunity with them and talk with them about, being engaged, and then also thinking about non-federal share, both strategies around non-federal share, but engaging with funders and others that are a necessary part of your program. We will also then have on August 25th a peer-to-peer call really highlighting some great exemplar programs and talking more about kind of model designs and different designs. One thing, Carol wanted to just jump in here and share a comment that she did not get to. So I'm going to just highlight, and Carol, if you want to jump in, but one of the things that we forgot to share that's really, really, really important for you while writing your proposal is that the FOA is really specific, that you should not directly address COVID-related issues. However, Carol can jump in here and share her recommendations around that.
Sure. It's like ludicrous, to be honest, that they ignored this. So I'm with you, whoever, I think it was Edel. I'm with you on your comment that COVID is a huge issue for us. But what I will say is that the way we're thinking of helping some of the groups that we're working with is to couch it in emergency readiness. So what we're going to talk about, because it's ridiculous not to include it, and what are the issues that family childcare will run into with this. Now, it may be that family childcare will become a preferred option since it's a smaller group and you can kind of contain things. I don't really know, but just so you know, there's specific instructions there not to mention COVID.
Great. Thanks, Carol. That's really helpful. So that's a great kind of question and call out. And another thing that I will just let you all know, that on the resource page, there's an area where you can ask questions. We'll have kind of a live, ongoing, updated FAQ to publish responses to those questions. But we are also really open to hearing what you need and what kinds of supports Homegrown and our partners at the Ounce and Kathy and Carol can provide. So, we really appreciate you making the time to be with us this afternoon. We hope this is helpful, and we really, really, really hope that you're thinking about how to include family childcare in your grants, because we think that's a really valuable model for the children who receive services in family childcare, for family childcare providers, and for Head Start grantees, and really look forward to the opportunity to support you in that process. So with that, I'm going to thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope to hear from you on the resource page, both with your questions, and we hope that you'll access the resources there. Thank you so much.